Raymond's lawyers filed their counterclaim the same night we filed ours, same hour. They weren't responding to us. They had written the story first, and we had just walked into it. That PDF was 63 pages long, and I could tell in the first paragraph that we were finished. Not because it was stronger than our filing, but because it existed at all. 6 months of preparation, every clause triple-checked, and Raymond had already submitted his version of events before we hit send on ours. The timestamp on his filing was 8:51 p.m. Ours was 11:58. He wasn't waiting to see what we'd do. He already knew. I sat at my desk and read the opening paragraph 3 times, and each time the same thought completed itself. We had walked into a room someone else had already furnished. What it cost me to understand how that was possible, that's what I'm about to tell you. That morning had started with the best version of everything we'd built. Caleb arrived at 7 carrying a manila folder in a flat white, and he spread the final draft across the conference table like it was something fragile. We both knew that. We'd been working toward this specific regulatory channel for 4 months because civil court would take 3 years and a budget we didn't have. But a formal complaint to the regulator, properly evidenced, could move in weeks. Caleb had color-coded the annexures. He'd checked every page number twice. We stood on either side of that table and read it aloud in sections, and for the first time in a long time, the whole thing felt solid. It felt like it might actually work. The core of our filing was simple, even if the language wasn't. Raymond had structured the acquisition of our IP as a $1 sale, signed by us, legally clean on its face, but a dollar sale only holds up if the company receiving the IP assumes real liability in return. Raymond's entity assumed nothing. It transferred the IP internally within 48 hours of the signing and left us holding obligations that no longer had assets behind them. That's not a sale. That's a transfer dressed as a sale. And the regulatory framework we were filing under had a specific provision for exactly that structure. We weren't alleging fraud loosely. We were citing the mechanism, the dates, the transfer records. That's why this channel mattered. That's why we spent 4 months building toward it instead of filing the moment we were angry enough to. Petra joined on video at 8:30, calling from her kitchen in a field jacket she'd clearly slept in. The platinum hair, the high cheekbones. She looked exactly like herself, but dimmed. Dark circles she wasn't hiding. We walked her through the annexure numbers, and she confirmed each one without hesitation, because Petra had always known the numbers better than any of us. But near the end of the call, she said something that I filed away without really examining. I just want this to be over. Not, I want us to win. Not, I want Raymond to answer for this. Just over. I thought I understood what she meant. I thought she was tired the same way the rest of us were tired. I didn't sit with the difference long enough. Sione showed up 40 minutes late and apologized in the way he always apologized. Genuinely. Briefly, without making it about himself. He had a takeaway coffee and a look I'd seen on him before, since early in the year. The look of a man carrying something he hasn't put down yet. He read the summary we'd prepared, asked 2 precise questions about the timeline, and then said it. Has Raymond been quiet lately? I told him yes, as far as we knew. He nodded, took a sip of his coffee, and didn't say anything else. I registered the question. I noted that it was slightly odd. And then the conversation moved and I let it go, because we had a filing to finish. And I told myself that Sione was just being cautious. That was the first place I looked away when I should have looked closer. We submitted at 11:58 p.m. Caleb hit the key and the confirmation timestamp appeared on the portal, and none of us moved for a moment. Then Caleb exhaled, one slow breath, and leaned back in his chair. I remember feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Forward motion, not relief exactly, not victory. Just the sensation of having moved after standing still for so long that you'd forgotten what movement felt like. We stayed in the office for another 40 minutes talking about nothing in particular, because none of us wanted to go home to the silence yet. Someone made more coffee. Caleb put on a playlist at low volume. For 40 minutes, we had done the thing, and the thing had not yet failed us. That was enough. Then my phone lit up. The notification was from the regulatory portal. A new filing in our matter. Counterclaim, case reference, stamped and received. I opened the document index before I was fully reading it, and the timestamp was the first thing I saw. 20:51:04, 8:51 in the evening. 3 hours before we'd submitted ours. My brain did the math twice because the first result didn't make sense. Raymond hadn't filed in response to us. He'd filed before us. He'd had this document ready, complete, submitted on the record, while we were still sitting in that office reading aloud for errors. The 40 minutes of quiet after our submission, the coffee, the low music. We had spent those 40 minutes feeling like we'd moved. And the whole time, Raymond's version of events had already been sitting in the system, waiting for ours to arrive beside it. Caleb pulled the full document, and we read the opening paragraph together, him aloud and me over his shoulder. Raymond's filing described a company in distress, undercapitalized, operationally stalled, unable to meet its obligations, and framed the $1 IP transfer as a negotiated rescue. Not a theft, a lifeline. The language was careful in a way that made it worse. It didn't overclaim, it didn't use loaded words, it simply presented a version of events in which Raymond was the reasonable adult in the room. And we were founders who had asked for help and then changed their minds about the terms. It was fluent, it was confident, and it was written in a tone that assumed it would be read first by someone who hadn't yet heard our side. Because it had been read first. That was the whole strategy. What made it genuinely frightening wasn't what Raymond got wrong, it was what he got right. Specific meeting dates that weren't in any public record. Internal shorthand we used for the IP categories, not the formal names, the ones we used in conversation. A description of a board discussion that matched the actual sequence of the conversation, not the sequence in the minutes. He hadn't reconstructed our internal workings from outside documents. He had access to something closer than that, not our files, but our language. The way we talked about things in rooms where we thought we were alone. I kept reading, and the specific accuracy of it kept compounding. And somewhere around page 4, I stopped feeling angry and started feeling something colder. Someone had been listening, or someone had been talking. Page 7. Buried in a section about operational cash flow during the disputed period, Raymond's filing cited a specific figure, $340,000. It was presented as evidence of insolvency, our internal projection of the cash shortfall at a specific moment in the company's timeline. That number was accurate. And it had never been in any document. I know that with certainty because I was the one who had asked Caleb to keep it out of written records. We'd discussed it in one meeting, 4 of us present, and I'd specifically said we weren't putting that figure anywhere until we understood what it meant for the acquisition conversation. It was a spoken number, a room number, and it was on page 7 of Raymond's regulatory filing. I closed the laptop and sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. I sent Caleb home at 2 in the morning because there was nothing more 2 people could do that one person sitting with it couldn't. I took a notepad, actual paper, which I almost never use, and I wrote down the 4 names, not as suspects, just as a way of making the room concrete, giving the problem a shape. The meeting had been in the small conference room on a Tuesday in March. Caleb, Petra, Sione, me. We'd been talking about what the cash shortfall would look like to an acquirer, whether $340,000 was a number we could defend or a number that would be used against us in any negotiation. No one had taken notes because I'd asked them not to. So the question wasn't who wrote it down. The question was who remembered it well enough to repeat it, and in what context, and to whom, and why. I sat there with the 4 names on the notepad and started working backward through the last 6 weeks. My phone rang at 8:15 the next morning. I was outside a cafe on Clement Street, hadn't slept more than 90 minutes, was holding a coffee I hadn't started yet. The number wasn't saved. I picked up because I always pick up numbers I don't recognize. Bad habit, or maybe just the reflex of someone who has been waiting for calls they didn't know to expect. She introduced herself clearly. Nadia Osei, outside counsel for Raymond's entity, calling as a professional courtesy. Her voice was precise and unhurried, and there was nothing in it that signaled threat. That was the first thing I noticed. When someone wants you to feel threatened, you hear it. Nadia sounded like she was scheduling a lunch meeting. She asked if I had 15 minutes. I said yes to the 15 minutes because I didn't know how to say no without signaling something I didn't want to signal yet. Nadia said Raymond had no interest in destruction. Her exact word, destruction, and that there was a structured path available if I wanted to hear the shape of it. She was careful never to call it a settlement. She called it a path. She said the regulatory process was long and expensive for everyone involved, and that her client believed there were terms under which all parties could move forward. She was not lying, exactly. She was not even spinning, exactly. She was just presenting a version of events in which the reasonable outcome happened to align with what Raymond wanted. It was the same voice as the counterclaim, fluent, confident, assuming it would be heard first. Before she hung up, she said one more thing, measured, almost gentle. Your partners may see this differently than you do. That was it. She didn't explain what she meant. She didn't need to. I stood in that doorway for a full minute after the call ended, the commuters moving around me, replaying the sentence. She had said partners, plural, not Caleb, not any one person. Partners, like she knew the shape of our alliance, like she had already mapped where the pressure points were and had chosen that word deliberately to make sure I'd spend the next hour thinking about it. I did. I spent the next hour thinking about nothing else. There was something Nadia knew about our side that she had chosen not to say, and the fact that she'd chosen not to say it was the most informative thing about the call. I called Caleb the second I was back on the street. He picked up on the first ring, which meant he hadn't slept either. He already knew about Petra. She'd called him that morning before Nadia had even finished introducing herself to me. Petra had received a written communication from Nadia's firm overnight, Caleb said. 12 pages, formal letterhead, delivered to her personal email. And Petra had told him she hadn't opened it yet. He said it the way you say something when you already know it isn't true. I sat down at a cafe table, coffee I never ordered appearing in front of me, and tried to figure out what hadn't opened it yet actually meant at 8:45 in the morning. Petra and I agreed to meet in person. Her suggestion, not mine, which I registered. A corner booth in a place on Talbot Street, the kind of cafe that's quiet by design and slightly too expensive for anyone who's actually worried about money. She was already there when I arrived, field jacket on, that cropped platinum hair catching the overhead light. She looked composed in a way that only happens when someone has been practicing the expression. And next to her coffee, closed was a laptop. Not the work machine we all used for shared drives and filings. Her personal one. I almost didn't clock it. I should have clocked it immediately. She asked her first question carefully, and she always did things carefully, and framed it as a procedural curiosity. If someone were to withdraw a regulatory filing at this stage, before any response had been formally logged, what would that trigger? I told her, adverse inference. Once it's in the record and you pull it, the reviewing body notes that you pulled it, and that notation travels. She nodded like she was filing it away, not like she was disappointed. That was the tell. A person asking out of genuine curiosity would have looked at least slightly concerned by the answer. Petra looked like she'd already done the math and was checking my arithmetic. Then she changed the subject to Sione, which in retrospect was not a change of subject at all. She mentioned he'd seemed distant lately. Distracted at the last check-in, she said, hard to reach by text. Then she dropped it in the way you drop something you want someone to pick up. He'd called her last week, she said, to ask whether she thought Raymond was the kind of person who follows through on offers. She looked out the window when she said it, not at me. The street outside was mid-morning ordinary, a delivery van, two women with a stroller, and Petra watched it like she was buying herself a second before I could ask the follow-up. I let the silence sit. She let it sit longer. I drove to Sione's neighborhood that afternoon, not the office, not a neutral space. His apartment building on the east side, 3 stories of dark brick, and a buzzer that always took 2 tries. He came down rather than letting me up, which told me something. We walked south without deciding to, past the corner store and the laundromat, and the place that used to be a hardware store, and Sione had his hands deep in his jacket pockets and was looking at the pavement, the way a person looks at something when they already know the conversation that's coming. He didn't ask why I'd shown up. He just walked beside me and waited for me to start. I asked about the $340,000 figure without preamble. Not where it came from, not how it might have appeared, just, do you remember a conversation where that number came up? Sione stopped walking. Not a slow stop, a full stop, like someone cut a cord. He stood outside the corner store under the awning and he didn't say anything for what felt like longer than it was. Then he said, I remember the call. Just that. Not defensive, not an excuse ready to go. He turned and looked at me, and his face was completely open in the way that only happens when someone has nothing left to protect because the thing they were protecting is already gone. 6 weeks ago, Raymond had called Sione personally, not through Nadia, not through any firm, using a number Sione recognized as Raymond's own mobile, the one he'd had when they were all still talking like adults. Raymond said he wanted to clear the air. He said he'd been worried about Sione specifically, which is the kind of thing you say to someone carrying guilt when you want to make it heavier. They talked for 20 minutes. Raymond asked about a specific month, not this month, a month from 8 months ago, and what the cash position had looked like during that window. And Sione told him. Because it was true, and because nobody had told him not to, and because Raymond asked like someone asking after an old friend's health. Raymond had been building the counterclaim for 6 weeks, not reacting to us, building, sourcing details through phone calls that sounded like check-ins, conversations that felt like courtesy. A question here and an answer there from someone who had no reason to think any of it was going anywhere. Sione's honest answer about a cash flow figure from 8 months ago had traveled from a 20-minute phone call into a legal filing submitted to a regulatory body at 8:51 p.m. on the same night we filed ours. That's the part I kept landing on. Standing there on the street while the light went. Not the betrayal. There wasn't one. The architecture of it. Raymond had known what question to ask and who to ask it to, and the whole thing had worked exactly because Sione had done nothing wrong. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment, because it would be easy to say I felt angry and leave it there. I wasn't, not at Sione. What I felt was something closer to vertigo, the specific kind you get when you realize the ground you've been standing on is not where you thought it was. Raymond hadn't needed a spy. He hadn't needed someone disloyal, or compromised, or afraid. He had needed one honest person who trusted him enough to answer a question plainly. An honest man is easier to use than a dishonest one because a dishonest person protects information instinctively. Sione had answered because it was the truth, and the truth had ended up on page 7 of a counterclaim with our names on it. I called the meeting for that evening without explaining why, just told them my apartment, 8 o'clock, no lawyers. Caleb confirmed immediately. Sione said he'd be there. Petra took 11 minutes to respond, then wrote, "Okay." One word. I stood in my kitchen with my jacket off and the blazer still on the chair behind me, and I rehearsed nothing. I'd learned years ago that you can't rehearse the moment you hand someone a fact they can't unknow. I could tell them what I'd found, lay it out cleanly, and then the room would do whatever rooms do when the thing holding them together has already quietly come apart. Petra arrived first, then Sione 3 minutes later, and when he stepped through the door and saw her already sitting in the living room, something passed between them. Not a look exactly, more a mutual recognition that the evening was going to be harder than whatever either of them had been bracing for. I turned the overhead off and left the floor lamp on, which I hadn't planned but which felt right. Nobody needed to be studied under bright light tonight. I stood rather than sat. I told them I knew where the $340,000 figure had come from. I told them it wasn't a breach and it wasn't a plant and it wasn't what any of us had been afraid it was. Then I laid out Raymond's call to Sione, the timeline, and the figure's path from a phone conversation to page 7. Sione confirmed it. Every detail. The mobile number, the framing of the call, the specific month Raymond had asked about. He didn't dress it up or apologize into a hole. He said what happened in order and stopped when it was finished. The room didn't turn on him. Nobody raised their voice. Caleb's voice came from the phone on the coffee table. I had had him on speaker from the start, and he said quietly, "That's how he operates. He's patient, and he picks honest people." Which is the most accurate thing anyone said that night, and also the hardest thing to sit with. Because it means the problem isn't fixable by being more careful. You can't protect yourself against someone who weaponizes the ordinary decency of your friends. Then Petra reached for the laptop, the personal one. She turned it to face the room without saying anything first, which was its own kind of announcement. The settlement offer from Nadia's firm filled the screen. 12 pages, clean formatting, each partner's name appearing in its own section. The numbers in a neat column on the right margin. I could read Petra's figure from where I was standing. I didn't look at Sione to see if he could read it too. The offer had been delivered 48 hours ago. She had been sitting with it for 2 days. Through the filing, through Nadia's call to me, through this morning's cafe conversation. And none of that showed on her face now. She was simply showing us what already existed. The offer was structured the way a careful person structures something they want accepted. Each partner named separately, not as a group separately, so the decision couldn't be made collectively, only individually. Petra's figure was specific enough to mean something real to someone who had been running on fumes for 8 months. There was no punitive language, no admission requirements, no clause that said she had done anything wrong. Just sign, withdraw, and go build something else. I could see the logic of it from the outside. I could even see the mercy in it, the way you can see mercy in a thing that was designed to be seen as merciful. The room was completely quiet. The city hum from outside filled in the silence, like water finding a level. Petra did not look like someone who had just blown up a partnership. She looked like someone who had finally put down something very heavy. She said it plainly. She was taking the settlement, and the steadiness in her voice was the most unsettling part. 8 months of burning through savings, 8 months of legal fees, and sleepless rewrites and regulatory filings that felt like sending messages into a void. She was not surrendering to Raymond. She was surrendering to arithmetic. There is a difference, and I understood it completely, and that made it worse. I did not argue. I had the argument ready. Every counterpoint, the structural weakness Caleb had spotted, the way Petra's withdrawal might actually help our position, and I let it sit. Because the thing she said was true. She had been running on fumes since January. She had 3 months of runway left in her personal account, maybe less. And this fight, for all the rightness of it, was eating the exact years she needed to build the next thing. I recognized the shape of that. I had made smaller versions of that same calculation myself at different moments, when the cost stopped being abstract. The alliance did not end in anger. It ended the way most real things end. Quietly, in a room that still smelled like takeout from 3 hours earlier, with everyone understanding and no one happy about it. Petra and Sione left within 10 minutes of each other. I stayed on the couch and called Caleb. Not to strategize, not yet, just to have a voice in the room. He picked up on the first ring, which told me he had been waiting. We talked in circles for a while, whether to amend the filing, whether to contact Nadia directly, whether any of this still made sense as a solo effort. Caleb is methodical, which means he never wastes energy on the version of events where he panics. He just keeps mapping. Around midnight, he said, "Let me read the counterclaim again. All of it. There might be something in how they structured the joint motive argument." I said, "Okay." I poured water I did not drink and stared at the ceiling and waited. It took Caleb 40 minutes. When he came back on, his voice had changed. Not excited, just precise, the way he gets when he has found something real. Raymond's counterclaim attributed motive to all three partners jointly. The framing depended on it. It needed all of us to have been acting in concert to make the narrative hold. But Petra withdrawing and accepting a separate settlement agreement broke that joint motive structure from the inside. A single sworn personal testimony from one partner, naming each person's actual role individually, would leave Raymond's filing arguing against a version of events that no longer existed. Caleb said it once and waited. I sat up. The filing had a seam, and we had just accidentally created the exact chisel that fit it. I opened the laptop at 1:47 a.m. and started typing. Not an amendment to the existing filing. A sworn personal testimony. My own, under my own name, and in the first person, 61 pages by the time I finished. I wrote everything Raymond wanted me to keep quiet. My own desperation in the early months, the months where I told myself the $1 sale was temporary, a bridge, something we could unwind later. My awareness of Petra's involvement in the final negotiation and what I chose not to ask her directly. Sione's introduction, and what I knew and what I told myself I did not need to know. None of it made me look like someone who had been purely wronged. Most of it made me look like a man who made small, incremental, individually defensible choices until he looked up and was somewhere he had not planned to be. I wrote it anyway. There is nothing cinematic about writing a document that can be used against you. It does not feel like release. It does not feel like courage. It feels like doing a thing that needs doing. Methodical and strange, like finally cleaning out a wound you have been managing around for months because looking directly at it felt worse than just working with the ache. I wrote a paragraph about the final negotiation with Raymond, the meeting where I had the chance to walk away and convince myself the terms were temporary. I wrote it once, read it back, and did not change anything. The accuracy was the point. The accuracy was the only thing I had left to offer the record that Raymond could not reframe, because it was mine, offered voluntarily against my own interest. I stopped twice. The first time was the paragraph about the final negotiation, the part where I had to write that I knew on some level what Raymond was doing and kept moving forward because the alternative felt worse at the time. I stared at that sentence for 4 minutes. Then I kept going. The second stop was Sione. Writing his name as a contributing factor, even with full context, even with the explanation that he had been maneuvered, felt like a betrayal of the man who had already had the worst night of his year. But leaving it out would have made the document a partial truth, which is just Raymond's method with my name on it. So I wrote it, completely, with the context intact. And I moved to the next paragraph. At 4:11 a.m., the document was 61 pages and complete. I could see the page count at the bottom of the screen. Every name was in it, every number, every moment where I had made a choice I had later rationalized into something cleaner than it was. There was a version of that document I could have written, shorter, tidier, with the unflattering parts smoothed into passive constructions. And it would have been technically true and functionally useless, because Raymond's lawyers would have found the gaps and filled them with his version. What I had instead was 61 pages that left no gap to fill. I read the title line one more time. I did not change it. The apartment was the color of deep gray nothing. That specific pre-dawn when the city has not quite decided to start. I read the whole thing once from the beginning, not to revise. I had made a decision about revision when I wrote the Sione paragraph and kept going. I read it to confirm I could stand behind every sentence when it was no longer 4 a.m. and I was no longer running on adrenaline and exhaustion. I scrolled slowly. There were sentences I did not love. There was a paragraph about the early months that made me sound exactly as scared as I had actually been, which is not how you want it to sound in a legal document. I kept it. By the time I reached the final page, the window was showing the first real gray of dawn, thin and cold. The city below is still mostly dark. I closed the document without changing anything. Then I opened the regulatory portal, 4:44 a.m. I pressed upload. The portal ran its verification. There is always a verification, a small spinning indicator that lasts about 8 seconds. And then the confirmation screen appeared. Filing received. Timestamp 04:44:22. I stared at it for a moment. Not in relief, not in triumph, just in the particular stillness of having done the thing. I pulled my hands back from the keyboard and set them in my lap. The cursor blinked on the confirmation. Outside the window, the city was beginning its first sounds. A truck somewhere, a distant siren already fading. Raymond's version of events had been on the record since 8:51 p.m. the night before last. Mine had been on the record for 22 seconds. That would have to be enough. I do not know if it worked. That is the honest version. The testimony is on the record. And Raymond's counterclaim has a structural problem that Caleb identified. And Petra made a decision that was right for her life, even if it cost us the alliance. And I do not know how any of it resolves. I know that Raymond's version is no longer the only version. I know that the detail on page 7, the $340,000, Sione's honest answer to a carefully aimed question, is now in the record with its full context, not Raymond's context. Whether a regulatory body reads it the way I need them to, whether the joint motive argument collapses the way Caleb thinks it should, whether any of this reaches a conclusion that looks like justice, I genuinely cannot tell you. What I can tell you is what was true at 4:44 in the morning, sitting in the dark, which is that I ran out of moves except the one that required me to be completely honest about myself. At the end of a fight you cannot fully control, there's a moment where strategy runs out, where the moves are exhausted and the alliances have dissolved, and the other side has more resources and more time and a version of events already filed and timestamped before yours. And in that moment, the only thing that is still yours, completely, uncontestably yours, is whether you told the truth about your own part in it. Not the heroic version. Not the version where your failures are framed as reasonable responses to impossible circumstances. The actual version. Petra took the settlement. Sione never meant to hand Raymond the ammunition. And I filed 61 pages at 4:44 in the morning that I would not have written differently if I had known in advance they would not change the outcome. That is not wisdom. That is just the thing I had left. Petra took the settlement. Sione never meant to hand Raymond the ammunition. And greed filed the full truth anyway, knowing it might not change anything. What would you have done in that room? Tell the full story or let it go?